The halls of Westminster fell silent. Britain's Prime Minister stood before the bench, not as the nation's leader, but as the accused. What happened next sent shockwaves through every corner of the United Kingdom, triggering scenes no one thought they'd witness in their lifetime. This is the story of how one moment in a courtroom tore the fabric of British politics apart and set the streets ablaze with fury. The morning of March 15th started like any other in London. Commuters filled the underground, cafes served their usual breakfast crowds, and the business of government carried on behind the imposing doors of number 10 Downing Street. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, something extraordinary was brewing. For weeks, whispers had circulated through Westminster's corridors about an investigation that had reached the highest levels of power. Journalists who'd caught wind of the story were told to stay quiet. Senior officials exchanged nervous glances in meetings, and Keir Starmer, the man who'd promised to restore integrity to British politics, knew his day of reckoning was approaching. The charges were unprecedented in modern British history. Allegations of misconduct in public office, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and abuse of power had been building for months. What started as routine questions about government contracts had snowballed into something far more serious. Documents had surfaced, witnesses had come forward. And despite every attempt to contain the situation, the investigation had taken on a life of its own. The Metropolitan Police, under immense pressure to act impartially, had no choice but to follow the evidence wherever it led, and it led straight to the Prime Minister's door. When the summons arrived at Downing Street that morning, the building erupted into controlled chaos. Senior advisors scrambled to understand what was happening. Legal teams were assembled in minutes. Phone calls were made to every corner of the establishment, from palace officials to party leaders, from media executives to union bosses. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was this really happening? Could the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom actually be arrested? The answer, as the nation would soon discover, was yes. The rule of law, that sacred principle Starmer himself had championed throughout his career, was about to be applied to him in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. By midday, news vans had surrounded the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand. Reporters who'd been tipped off about the hearing jostled for position on the courthouse steps. Social media exploded with speculation. Within minutes, hashtags were trending worldwide. International news networks interrupted their regular programming to bring viewers breaking coverage from London. The scene was surreal. Police barriers went up. Crowds began to gather. Protesters arrived from both sides of the political spectrum, some demanding justice, others defending their leader. The atmosphere was electric with tension and disbelief. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings began with an eerie formality. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Legal representatives took their positions, and then, through a side entrance usually reserved for defendants in criminal cases, Keir Starmer walked in. Not in his usual sharp suit, striding confidently to the dispatch box, but flanked by officers. His face a mask of grim determination. The man who'd spent decades as a human rights lawyer, who'd served as director of public prosecutions, who'd stood in countless courtrooms defending the principles of British justice, now found himself on the other side of that system. The irony was not lost on anyone in that room. The charges were read aloud in the stark procedural language of the law. Each allegation detailed specific dates, specific actions, specific decisions that prosecutors claimed crossed the line from political judgment into criminal conduct. The case revolved around a series of government contracts awarded during a national crisis. Questions had been raised about whether proper procedures were followed, whether conflicts of interest were disclosed, whether the Prime Minister had used his position to benefit associates and suppress investigations into wrongdoing. What made the allegations particularly damaging was the involvement of recorded conversations and internal documents that appeared to show a deliberate cover-up. Evidence that prosecutors claimed proved Starmer knew about problems and actively worked to hide them from Parliament and the public. As the prosecution laid out their case, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Each piece of evidence seemed to build on the last, creating a narrative of systemic corruption at the heart of government. The defence team objected repeatedly, arguing that political decisions were being criminalised, that the Prime Minister's actions were within the scope of his authority, that this was a politically motivated prosecution designed to overturn the results of a democratic election. But the judge allowed the proceedings to continue, noting that the questions raised were serious enough to warrant a full examination. The legal arguments flew back and forth, technical and complex, but the underlying message was clear. The Prime Minister was in serious trouble. Then came the moment that changed everything. After hours of legal debate, that the prosecution made an unexpected move. They requested that Keir Starmer be taken into custody pending trial, arguing that he posed a flight risk and that the integrity of the investigation could be compromised if he remained in office with access to government resources and personnel. The courtroom erupted. Defence lawyers jumped to their feet. Voices raised in protest. Journalists in the gallery scrambled for their phones. Outside, the crowd that had been waiting for news seemed to sense something dramatic was happening. The judge called for order, silenced the room with a sharp rap of the gavel, and announced a brief recess to consider the application. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. Inside the courthouse, Starmer sat in a holding area surrounded by his legal team, probably replaying every decision that had led to this moment. Outside, the crowd had swelled to hundreds, then thousands. News helicopters circled overhead. Police reinforcements arrived, forming lines to keep opposing groups separated. Social media was on fire with speculation, conspiracy theories, and increasingly heated rhetoric. Political leaders across the spectrum scrambled to respond, issuing carefully worded statements that tried to balance respect for the legal process with their own political positions. The country was holding its breath. When the judge returned, the silence was absolute. In measured tones, citing the seriousness of the charges and the unique circumstances of the case, the decision was announced. Bail would be denied. Keir Starmer would be remanded in custody. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was being arrested right there in the courtroom. The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible and yet undeniable. Officers moved forward. Procedure demanded they follow protocol regardless of who stood before them. And as handcuffs were produced, as the formal words of arrest were spoken, the reality of what was happening finally truly sank in for everyone watching. The images that emerged from that courtroom would define a generation. Photographers captured the moment from every angle, their cameras clicking furiously as Britain's Prime Minister was led away in handcuffs. The photos spread across the internet within seconds, appearing on news websites, social media feeds, and television screens around the world. In living rooms and offices across Britain, people stopped what they were doing and stared in disbelief at their screens. This wasn't supposed to happen in a stable democracy. This wasn't how the British system worked. Prime ministers resigned in disgrace. They faced votes of no confidence. They were defeated at the ballot box, but arrested. Taken into custody like a common criminal. The precedent was shattering, and the implications were impossible to fully grasp in those first chaotic moments. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate and explosive. The crowd that had been waiting for news suddenly had their answer, and it split them down the middle. Supporters of the Prime Minister erupted in anger, screaming that this was a coup, a conspiracy, an establishment plot to remove a democratically elected leader. They surged forward against police barriers, their fury palpable and dangerous. On the other side, those who believed in the charges cheered and chanted, demanding justice and accountability. The two groups faced each other across a thin line of police officers, and the potential for violence hung heavy in the air. Bottles were thrown. Pushing and shoving broke out in several places. Police in riot gear moved in to separate the factions, but the tension only continued to build. Within an hour, similar scenes were unfolding in cities across Britain. In Manchester, thousands gathered in Piccadilly Gardens, their protests blocking traffic and bringing the city centre to a standstill. In Birmingham, demonstrations outside the council offices turned heated as pro-government and anti-government groups clashed with each other and with police. Glasgow saw some of the most intense confrontations, with reports of property damage and multiple arrests. Cardiff, Belfast, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Leeds, every major city experienced its own version of the chaos. The speed with which these protests materialised suggested they weren't entirely spontaneous. Organisations on both sides had been preparing for this possibility, mobilising their supporters through encrypted messaging apps and social media networks. Now those plans were being executed and Britain's streets were transforming into battlegrounds. The political establishment went into crisis mode. In Westminster, an emergency cabinet meeting was called, but the question of who actually had the authority to chair it remained unclear. The Deputy Prime Minister assumed control, but opponents immediately questioned the legitimacy of any decisions made without the elected Prime Minister present. Opposition parties demanded an immediate general election, arguing that the government had lost all moral authority to govern. Some MPs from the ruling party broke ranks, calling for Starmer to resign even as they condemned what they saw as a politically motivated prosecution. Others doubled down in their support, claiming this was exactly the kind of establishment backlash their movement had always warned about. Parliament itself became a scene of unprecedented disorder, with shouting matches breaking out on the floor and several MPs having to be escorted out by security. The financial markets reacted with predictable panic. The pound plummeted against major currencies as traders fled to safety. The FTSE dropped sharply in emergency trading sessions, wiping billions off the value of British companies. International investors, already nervous about British stability following years of political turmoil, began pulling money out of UK assets at an alarming rate. Business leaders issued urgent statements calling for calm and stability, but their words did little to stop the bleeding. The economic consequences of this political earthquake were immediate and severe, threatening jobs, pensions, and the financial security of millions of ordinary Britons who had no involvement in the political drama but would nonetheless pay the price for it. International reaction added another layer of complexity to the crisis. Allied governments watched in shock as one of the world's oldest democracies descended into chaos. The United States issued a carefully neutral statement expressing confidence in British institutions, while avoiding any comment on the specifics of the case. European leaders were less diplomatic, with some suggesting this vindicated their concerns about British governance, and others worrying about the precedent it set for prosecuting political leaders. Russia and China predictably used the crisis to attack Western democratic systems, broadcasting images of British protesters clashing with police as evidence that democracy was inherently unstable and hypocritical. The soft power and international standing that Britain had carefully cultivated for centuries was evaporating in real time, replaced by images of disorder and institutional collapse. As night fell on that first day, Britain was a country transformed. Police forces across the nation reported being stretched to breaking points, struggling to contain multiple protest sites while maintaining normal law enforcement operations. Hospitals in major cities went on alert, preparing for potential casualties from the unrest. Public transport was disrupted in dozens of locations, leaving commuters stranded and adding to the sense of chaos. Social media platforms struggled to manage the flood of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and inflammatory content spreading across their networks. Fact-checkers worked overtime trying to separate truth from fiction. But in the heat of the moment, most people believed what confirmed their existing views and dismissed everything else as propaganda. The country was fracturing along lines that had been forming for years, and the arrest of the Prime Minister had simply made those divisions impossible to ignore or paper over any longer. Britain was entering uncharted territory, and nobody knew where it would lead. The second day brought no relief, only an escalation of tensions that seemed to feed on themselves with terrifying momentum. Overnight, the protests had not dissipated, but instead grown more organised and more determined. What had begun as spontaneous gatherings of outraged citizens transformed into coordinated movements with clear demands and sophisticated tactics. Protest camps sprang up in central London, with tents and makeshift shelters appearing in Parliament Square and Trafalgar Square. The authorities faced an impossible choice: allow the occupations to continue and risk losing control of the capital, or move to clear them and risk sparking even greater violence. Every decision carried enormous risk, and the absence of clear political leadership made those decisions even harder to navigate. The Deputy Prime Minister lacked the authority and the public confidence to make definitive calls, and every statement from government officials only seemed to inflame tensions further rather than calm them. The media landscape became a battlefield of competing narratives, each side convinced of their absolute righteousness and the absolute corruption of their opponents. News channels split along predictable lines, some portraying Starmer as a martyr being persecuted by shadowy forces within the establishment, others presenting him as a criminal finally facing justice for abuses of power. Social media amplified the most extreme voices on both sides, with algorithms designed to maximise engagement, pushing the most inflammatory content to the top of everyone's feeds. Misinformation spread faster than fact-checkers could possibly debunk it. Doctored videos, fake quotes, and conspiracy theories went viral within minutes, each one adding fuel to fires that were already burning out of control. Trust in institutions, already damaged by years of political scandals and controversies, collapsed entirely as people retreated into information bubbles that confirmed their existing beliefs and painted anyone who disagreed as either deluded or actively evil. Behind the scenes, the legal proceedings continued with a cold formality that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. Starmer appeared before magistrates for a bail hearing, his legal team mounting an aggressive challenge to his continued detention. They argued that holding a sitting Prime Minister in custody was unprecedented and unnecessary, that he had no criminal record, that he had deep ties to the community, and that there was no realistic flight risk. The prosecution countered that the severity of the charges and the evidence of potential obstruction of justice made detention essential. They presented phone records, emails, and testimony suggesting that Starmer had been aware of problems with government contracts and had actively worked to suppress investigations. The back and forth was technical and detailed, but the stakes could not have been higher. Outside the courthouse, thousands waited for news, the crowd even larger than the day before, the police presence even more overwhelming. Across Britain, the disruption to daily life intensified. Major roads were blocked by protesters in multiple cities, creating massive traffic jams and preventing emergency services from responding quickly to calls. Several hospitals reported being unable to receive critical supplies due to the transportation chaos. Schools in affected areas closed, leaving parents scrambling to arrange childcare. Businesses shut their doors, unwilling to risk damage or unable to operate with so few customers and employees able to reach them. The economic costs mounted by the hour, with estimates suggesting billions of pounds in lost productivity and damaged infrastructure. Small business owners who had nothing to do with politics watched helplessly as their livelihoods suffered, caught in the crossfire of a conflict they had no power to influence. The anger and frustration felt by ordinary people trying to live their lives added another volatile element to an already explosive situation. The police themselves became a flashpoint of controversy. Officers found themselves in an impossible position, tasked with maintaining order while being accused of bias by whichever side disagreed with their actions. When they moved to clear protesters from roads, they were attacked as tools of oppression. When they held back from confronting demonstrators, they were accused of allowing lawlessness. Several incidents of excessive force were caught on camera and spread instantly across social media, triggering fresh outrage and calls for accountability. Officers reported feeling targeted and unsafe, with some refusing to deploy without additional protective equipment. Police unions issued statements warning that their members were being pushed beyond reasonable limits. The very institutions meant to hold society together were straining under pressure they were never designed to withstand, and cracks were beginning to show in ways that threatened to become irreparable.